Clear resonances with the work of Abdullah al-Sadi. And what you see here are a sample of some of the books and journals and diaries out of which Abdullah has created 9, not 1 or 2, but 9 of his own alphabets. The latest one being in the shape of glaciers from the South Pole. Samson Young looks at ideas of translation, not just between languages, but between linguistic systems of meaning, from semantic language to musical language. So words that don't make sense, that when sung become melodies that do. So one entry was through language, another is through sites, whether they be sacred sites, like the 16 oldest mosques in Hajar Wahid's architectural studies, which are surveyed by the U2 spy plane, or this beautiful and intimate house made by the artist's own skin. He suffered from sickle cell anemia, all in the house of my father, reminds us of both the sort of the fragility and intimacy of our family home. These 15 drawings, this suite of drawings, are hotels from all around the world, all called metropolitan. So thinking about these dreams and ideas that we share as a sort of humanity. And punctuating and kind of connecting this focus on language and focus on architecture and sites are a series of works that look at, so both sculptures, so you see the floor-based wooden sculpture of Kim Lim, the wall-mounted domestic elevations of Seema Nusrat, which combine aesthetics, again, with security. And these works and these artists are concerned with how to punctuate space. You see the bookshelf-like structure of Abigail Reynolds' work. The work is called When Words Are Forgotten. Also in conversation with Rachel Whiteread's negative mold of the black books. Books that you cannot read, that you cannot access. Histories that are unavailable to you. And on the floor is Nazgul and Sarinia's Article 49, Pillars, that reminds us that laws, regulations, rituals, these are all sort of rules that become pillars that societies rest on. Joanna Petrovska's photograph here shows how books can also be shelters, can also be these stores of knowledge that you can try and absorb. And last but not least in this is a reminder, both for the exhibition but also for life, that we have to journey through it. You know, these sites are very much about how we make sense of the world. And we make sense of the world not just by ourselves, but in conversation with others. And just like we have books as one of the main stores of knowledge that also, through their circulation, become a mean of sharing knowledge, I would sort of argue that cinema plays that role. And I suppose, Marysia, this is a good point to turn to you to talk to us a little bit about your project, Cinema Island, and then we can, what is it and how did it come about?
So, I have met Hammad during my time as an artist in residence in Hong Kong. I was there for almost 3 years between 2013 and 16. So we already established a kind of a sense of conversation then. And one of the projects that I developed in Hong Kong was a project called Cinema Island. And so Hammad had, I guess, opportunity to both talk about the project then and to witness how it works. So when this invitation came, now which was actually not now, but at the beginning of this year, with this specific request to try and think how we could work by staging this project here. Of course, what is specific about this is that each time I am very interested in the context where the cinema will be placed, and that is both the context of the exhibition and its theme, which Hammad proposed, and also the context of the culture. I have not ever been to the Middle East before, so for me the sort of impetus was to think, what is my relationship to this part of the world? And one of the I guess important parts was that my father, I was born in Poland, and my father was a graphic designer, and he illustrated Arabian Nights, and that particular edition was published in London in 1964. So I already felt that, in fact, what is informing the project is also not just cinema or not just film, but the story. So I guess I could just run a little bit forward. And for each of the, I also made other cinema buildings, pavilions before, and worked with a different architect. And this time, I thought it was important to work with architects that had a connection to this region. So as a kind of invitation, during my research time here in April, I tried to meet as many people as possible, and during those meetings, I was meeting architects and also people who are connected to kind of animating culture here in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, and in Sharjah. So I was really trying to kind of map out what people were doing here, what they were thinking, and how that can kind of bring together the project. So I wrote a competition brief for the pavilion and invited 10 different practices which were from the region or connected to the region. And these three wonderful people who call themselves MMI architects, who have studied at the Architectural Association in London, put in a proposal which was chosen. So you see from your left, George Massoud, Summer Islam, and Aram Moradian. So they, we began working on the architecture of the pavilion, and while they were designing, I was beginning to think about the film. So this is very, very important to me, that there is a relationship between the architecture and the film. And I decided that the film would be solely based on archival materials that are related to this part of the world. Now, that's a huge challenge to try and find archives or footage that one would be able to not just watch, but also to use and edit and make a new work of art.
Just to underline this, so Marysia, April was the first time you actually stepped foot in the region, not just in the UAE per se, yeah?
That's right, yeah. So I'm just showing you the pavilion in case you have not come across it. I hope you have experienced it not just as a piece of architecture, but also were curious enough to go in. I think this particular form has been very, very well thought out to both let you see that there are people inside, and while you're inside, to be able to see outside. And this entry point to the space is this point where you have to commit, where you have to make a decision. You actually have to lift up the piece of fabric to find yourself inside. And this openness is there for you to discover. It is not something that, in fact, is given. You have to be engaged in order to step in. And once you're in, what you encounter is a film which is made, as I said, solely from archival footage, which I was searching for, well, virtually most of the...
Which archives specifically are now in the film?
So well, I did contact the National Archives here in Abu Dhabi, but didn't really have much luck in accessing any of the materials for procedural reasons. And if I had more time, maybe that would have been possible. So I identified BP Archive in the UK, which really had a lot of material, as BP has been very present in this part of the world since the 1940s. And they were interested in sort of becoming virtually a collaborator. So they let me use about 7 hours of footage in order to make this film. But of course, those films that were made by BP, first of all, are predominantly about oil and also about British people who are doing things to build the, well, at the time it wasn't called the UAE. So they have maybe a kind of a limited range of what they represent. They represent a lot of kind of official dealings, and they're, of course, shot by men and by professional cameramen. So their point of view is already mediated by the fact that they have been trained in Britain, and they very rarely kind of come from this part of the world. So I was interested to try and find archives that would be private and amateur, and of course that kind of relates to my other projects that maybe we don't have that much time to talk about.
But Bant, could you sort of share why this focus on the amateur? What is it about the amateur that attracts you?
Well, there are many aspects to this. I'm very interested in self-archiving, or how people record their own lives. And, from a certain point in the technology, people had access to cameras. So it was no longer necessary for someone to own to be a professional and to have a camera that belonged to someone else. From the about mid-80s, people begin to own cameras which are camcorders. And that means that they are just recording their lives and their everyday. So if you like, it's sort of carrying on from the family album. The video becomes another form of recording one's own life. But so what I was interested in trying to find this amateur, the amateur is really, as you probably know, the word amateur is relates to love, someone who loves doing, and in this case, maybe they're not necessarily people who love making films, but they were people whose kind of family life was important to them. And this self-image, or creating this really important way of kind of thinking through one's own life with the camera was, I felt, necessary in order to offset what the BP footage was saying. So I was incredibly lucky to well, I must say that I'm very, very indebted to Diala Nusabeh, who put me in touch with a lot of people and asked them to virtually open their archives or whatever they shot during the last 30 years. But it's a very, very difficult decision for people to share what is incredibly personal and what was recorded as a kind of memento for their own family and not. So it's very private, and privacy in this part of the world is especially important. As we see everywhere, there are high walls, there are courtyards. So access or a decision to be able to see someone's life, I think that was, very, very difficult moment.
And that's also sort of very much apparent in the structure that you've come up with. If we go back here, so just that idea of being that people's feet can be seen, that boundary between the private and public is something that you're very consciously playing with. And even when you see here, we've been observing people and how they interact with Cinema Island. And quite often you see people pause at this threshold, just saying, okay, do we, should we, So there is this, there's an openness, but it's also an openness which requires a certain action.
And I think, the cinema space is a social space. And when I was in the last 3 days since the project opened, I had so many conversations also inside the cinema, outside of the cinema. I saw people who were in conversation with each other who obviously only met in front of the film. So it's a really important trigger for people to begin connecting via something that also is incredibly familiar to them. On one hand, everyone now has an Instagram account and is constantly using their phones to photograph. But what happened then, I think to just come back to the private footage, is that one person responded to this request and shared the footage that his father shot in the early 1990s. And this is what you see here. Now this person, his name is Ahmed Al-Arif, and he is himself an artist and designer based here. So I think, there was also this kind of, I would say, he was responding to something that he never, if you like, wanted to use this footage, but he understood why it was of interest to me.
And one of the things that really surprised me is I recognize where this place is. This is northern Pakistan. This is about an hour's drive from where where partly I grew up. And it was interesting to me that there are Emirati families who are holidaying for the snow in northern Pakistan back in the late 80s, early 90s. I think if you were to share that information now, it would be unimaginable to a new generation that they would ski in northern Pakistan.
That's right, that's right.
Sorry.
This is, so to be able to use this footage, and also, there's a lot of negotiations that are involved in making a project like this. I mean, negotiations that are with individuals for whom, this is their life, and they really are letting go of any control of it. Once it's part of the film, it really, it is open to all kinds of interpretations.
I think, Marysia, do you want to, given that we had this very interesting subtitle up there with the big piece of meat falling from the sky.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk a little about what you did with voice and sound in the film.
Yes, so most of the BP footage is either mute, silent, or has a voiceover of a man telling you about successes of the corporation or oil excavation and so on. So I really wasn't interested in any of those narratives. And what happened in April when I was here during research, I met many women who were really running the cultural scene here. So I thought it was, I mean, for cultural reasons, I was not able to show any women that were part of the private footage. So I thought it was important to introduce women through the voice. So I went back to those women who I met originally during my trips and asked them if they would be willing to tell a story in their mother's tongue. So they all speak Arabic, but of course in different dialects because they do come from different parts of the Middle East. So this story is the story of Sinbad from Arabian Nights, and it's told by an artist based in Dubai called Hind Mazaina. What interested me as well is that when you have images of women, there are it's a kind of ritual when they're watched by a group of men. And I quite like this idea that what you see here, and you see the jewelry and the costume, and then you have a cut to the museum where, you know, those very same, if you like, artifacts are now part of a display case. So this kind of back and forth between the memory of something, the memory of the use of something before it becomes a museum object. This is a beautiful black and white footage which for some reason ended up in the BP archive, but it's a film by Louis Malle, an important French director from 1953. He made a whole really very, very special film, which is of a French expedition looking for oil. And here you see a man barehanded excavating or kind of beginning an excavation. This is the private footage of Ahmed al-Attar and his father with the camcorder. Now, in between, so I created a 20-minute film which is in 5 chapters of around 4 minutes. And these chapters are separated by glitches that are very much kind of reminding you of the material of video in this case, or other kind of glitches which belong to film. So since my material is from the 50s to the 90s, what you also have is 40 years history of technology and changes in recording technology. And that's very, very important. So, you know, the BP people these are how they were shooting. And of course, you saw...
We've seen Ahmed's father with the camcorder.
With the camcorder. Yeah, so I was interested in tenderness that exists in Arabic culture that is kind of very rarely or possibly difficult to talk about and to represent. And I felt that by editing the film and constructing the film in a very particular way, the edit itself has a lot of tenderness. You know, I could only I couldn't praise more my editor, who put enormous amount of work to really make something that even without kind of knowledge of all these different elements, you get a sense of a very specific kind of emotional space.
One of the things before we move on to that perhaps is also the place of song, Marysia. Why did you feel it necessary for song?
Well, because when you think of the voice, and one way we hear the voice is women who tell the story or read the story. I very much associate the presence of voice with singing. And when I work on this in London, and I had a young assistant, a student who is Syrian, and of course helped me with the Arabic, and also very much introduced me to the culture and different aspects of the culture. And I asked her if she knew of anyone who can sing. And she introduced me to a friend of hers. And just hearing the voice and the power of the voice as an instrument, really for me sort of completed the task of creating this kind of emotional space.
But then how did you extend the invitation for somebody to sing in a language that you do not know? So how are you making those decisions? How did you establish that trust?
That's a very good question. I mean, that is part of, I would say, what, art that one encounters. You have to, in fact, trust kind of comes at every level to, first of all, engagement with you as a curator. So there's a trust that we need to establish. There's a trust that needs to be established between everyone who's involved in making, such a thing as the Cinema Island or the film. But, I have been around for a long time. And in fact, all my projects take a long time to develop because I guess I'm just very, very committed to the idea that you cannot really achieve anything unless you establish the trust. With, whether it's, in my previous project, like, with the Bank of England, it took 2 years to persuade the Bank of England to kind of open up to a project, or, for cultural reasons. I did a project in Poland, where I come from, looking at, amateur films made under communism. People didn't really want to think about communism when I approached them in the early 2000s. So you needed to have many, many different conversations to bring you to that moment where people know that whatever they share with you, you won't abuse it. So I think, with the singer, I trusted the person I was working with, my assistant, who was already working with me for a number of months, that it was, in fact, she was the person who was mediating between us, and therefore that was fine. And, every project is a project of trust, but also risk. And it's important to take that risk. And sometimes, it's because you take the risk, there is something added that, everyone who has ever experienced, well, I guess through their own creativity knows that, that kind of decision-making, it really adds something if you feel you're pushing yourself, the ideas, what you can and want to a level that none of the previous project maybe achieved. I wanted to show this simply because to also remind everyone that making a project of this kind, and especially making a film, is a truly collaborative effort. And there's so many different collective decisions that make that possible. So it also means managing so many people, which can be, it's quite exhausting, but worth it.
I think this is a good point to pause and see if there are any questions in the audience, because we both live in London, so we can always carry on this conversation at our own pace. But are there any sort of questions from the audience that you want to pose to either Marysia or myself? Well, while you're gathering your thoughts, and I'll make that offer again, one of the things that you just mentioned right now, Marysia, was this, when you were talking about the project in Poland, and this act of gaining trust. It sort of reminded me about, because actually what you're dealing with, your medium, although it is film and it's architecture, it's actually memory. And sort of the circulation of that memory. So it's an extremely precious commodity. It's something that's shaped and reshaped all the time. And I think it's also shaped by the circumstances you grow up with. And the circumstances you were describing, or perhaps I'm reading into, revisiting communism in the early 21st century, is perhaps not a journey that people want to go on. And I wonder, as you reflect on that project, what frames that set up, or how that helped you, or framed this project?
I think the entry point for the project in Poland was a sense that, well, I moved away from Poland in the mid-'80s, so by the time I was working on the project of Enthusiasts, it was 2002, so it's 15 years later. And I had a sense that, or my interest is in unacknowledged knowledge. So a knowledge which, in fact, has never, ever entered any kind of public conversation because, well, for many reasons. In the case of the amateur filmmakers in Poland under communism, I detected this double repression. So they were never really present in the discourse after 1989, when Poland moved on from communism to, some form of democracy, is so that, first of all, they were not professionals, so there was a kind of repressed memory of the fact that they didn't really make a contribution because they were not professionals.
Or just that their contribution was not recognized.
Exactly.
It's not part of a narrative.
Yeah. And secondly, in 2002, no one in Poland wanted to talk about communism because, they were happy to just get out of it. So there was the second repression. So how do you acknowledge and bring the creativity of incredible number of people? I mean, these filmmakers, there were thousands of them active between 1950s and 1985. And an interesting connection is that in 1985, they no longer gather in these film clubs because the camcorder comes in. So they no longer need the equipment of the film club to make films. So in fact, the film clubs kind of collapsed. Yeah, but during the communist time, it's also a social space. It's a space where they meet and discuss, and it's a space of resistance of some sort. So I think, the kind of the parallels are, where is the knowledge which is not part of the kind of public discourse yet? So possibly it is it lost, or is it that it can be found in different type of artifacts? So, amateur film is one of those.
But I mean, it's one thing finding it. It's quite another to then create a mode of sharing it.
Yeah, that's the most important part. Yeah.
And I think one of would you share a little bit about what you did to create a platform for sharing the material that came out of these Polish amateur filmmakers?
Yeah. So really, in a sort of short way, what you need to think through is it's pretty much a kind of conceptual project. It's creating a platform in order for those films to make them available. So that's really the artwork. I mean, the artwork is not building the cinema. In the end, many people build cinemas, many people show films, but to make this connection between a whole lost, kind of treasure of films. We, I guess, digitized about 300 films and archived them. But before they were archived, they were shown in a number of exhibitions. So we created cinemas of a very different kind in a gallery space, where these films would be properly seen and acknowledged as cinema. Because, there is, and also in this exhibition, there is many monitors where you see a moving image. Not all of it is cinema. So that distinction between also celebrating the fact that cinema is something other than simply video footage, however impressive it might be in terms of kind of technical achievement. Cinema is not just a black room with chairs in it or a bench. Cinema is this kind of social space. So that's what was created in order to show those films. But subsequently, I worked collaboratively with Neil Cummings at the time. We built an archive, and that's a whole different proposition, which means that out of dispersed materials, you find a system where other people can now use and access these films. So, and this as an artwork is just entered the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, so other people will be able to access it.
But can you explain a little bit? Because although I know the story, I think it's an interesting story to tell, and also in the context of an art fair. Because art is one of those beautiful things which has the capacity to take on multiple forms. It can be, it's a commodity, it's a political proposition, it's a philosophical idea, and the fact that you had the museum acquire the work and then make them share it. How did that process come about?
Well, I think I guess it's a long-term commitment. And as an artist, I suppose either very early on in when you begin to be part of a community or ecology of art, you realize that there are many different ways through which you can participate. And of course, the market, commercial galleries is one way of participating. But there are other ways. And I think in my, let's say, relatively long history of being active as an artist, my emphasis has always been on thinking about art as a critical practice and as a social practice. And therefore, questions of ownership are paramount to that. So rather than giving, if you like, all the rights to a gallerist or a dealer, I think, I have been successful in maintaining a certain amount of independence, but without kind of locking myself into some kind of ideological separation from the market. It's actually thinking that the more you share, the more people want to work with you. And as an artist, that's really what you want. I mean, when people share work by selling work, is because they want that work to be circulating somewhere. My idea of sharing is very different, and therefore, when at a certain point, as you probably know, someone called Lawrence Lessig came up with the Creative Commons licenses, I thought that was a fantastic instrument to help artists to license their, cultural outcomes in order to share it with others. And so the archive is a very, very good example where, yes, the museum has acquired an archive which was made by us as artists for their collection, but they did not, they don't really own it, because all the films, before they became part of the archive, have been licensed under the Creative Commons, which means that the museum is really just looking after that set of films in perpetuity. And that's a very important part, is that, that's what museums do. Their mandate is to look after artifacts in perpetuity. Now here, they will have to maintain the servers in order for the archive to be available to future generations. So, it's a very, very happy ending to a project that began in 2002, that in 2019, which is when it will open in the museum, or will be available in the museum in Warsaw, which is 17 years later, it really begins to live in a fully public way. And I think that patience, I think this is such an important thing, especially when you're sitting in the part of the world, and we have just seen this morning, which, is 7,000 years old, is to think of time differently, is to think of a long, long past and a kind of long, long future.
On that subject of long, long future, and you've just laid out your past project in a 17-year time horizon. We're now about 11 months since we first had that conversation around, Marysia, will you accept this invitation to think about what you would do with Cinema Island here? Now that you've had a few days to see and mini reflection, what is the immediate future for Cinema Island in this iteration?
Well, I think, given the constraints that I worked with and the kind of limitations of time, to find people who would be willing to share their archives is a very, very long process of building trust and meeting and so on. So I think, I can see how I would like to find many more people who would be willing to share their private archives and build new chapters and add new chapters to this edition of Cinema Island, and possibly place it in another environment. It could be an environment of a university or a school, for other people to also think of using it. So maybe, adding their films, so that it sort of begins to work both as an archive, a cinema space, a library, exchanging knowledge that is here.
I think I'll sort of end here on an anecdote, and I think there's very few of us here, so we can easily carry on the conversation in the corridor. But every time, one of the things about communicating with Marysia is, you have at the bottom of your email your name, your email address, the next exhibition that you will be attending or whatever. The bottom of Marysia's email says, share what you know. And if you get enough of them, it starts becoming like an imperative, It's a command. And I think it is a command delivered in the softest of manners, but it's no less imperative for it. So thank you, Marysia, for sharing what you know and encouraging us to share what we know. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at Cinema Island, please do. Spend as much time or as little time as you would like, but do lift that cover. And to illustrate and demonstrate that point on trust, the first time I saw the film was actually when the installation was going up. And I'm sort of ever so grateful, Marysia, that you took on this invitation. And thank you to Abu Dhabi Art for allowing us, for extending this invitation in the spirit of producing something which is risky, where neither of us knew where it would turn out. Thank you, and thank you for coming. And
thank you.